So we're going to move now to the topic for the day. I love that your cat is there. I want to just get my mid-sized dog on my shoulders, and that somehow that would match things.
Yeah.
So in one of our interviews for your whiteness research project, I used a phrase that you kind of responded to, that it's saying you'd like to hear more about that or something like that. That's how I remember it. Maybe I'm over remembering. Oh yeah. Oh shoot! I have to. There's the introduction piece I forgot. What do you think my middle name is?
Oh, it's obviously Vander.
No. You. In terms of how I behave in a group, you said once that my middle name should be.
Wasn't it like provocateur?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I kind of want that on the record too. That's
yeah. Pete Provocateur Van de Beek.
So I tend to be, and I've learned to own this in myself, I tend to be the idiot that asks the hard question or the obvious question, or that calls the emperor naked, when everybody else is saying no, So that's a part of my character that I'm trying to own now. And so sometimes that just shows in surprising ways. So what was that phrase that you found interesting, that you wanted to hear more about?
Oh my gosh, Pete, no. I got up at 4:30 this morning. I can't remember that.
I remember it as cultural Christianity.
Thank you. Okay, because we had just mentioned that in the introduction. So cultural Christianity, let me talk about, so this has kind of surfaced in my interviews.
Okay.
Around the ways in which Christianity doesn't necessarily, and I'm sure as with an individual with your background and what you do, this will be I'm sure we basically understand this very differently. But in my understanding, cultural Christianity is about the ways in which everyday life is shaped around particular religious identities. So the fact that we follow a Judeo-Christian calendar, the fact that we have certain holidays that are observed by our city, province, and nation, which incorporate Christian holidays. Just as an example, the fact that we pay for, with taxes, you have the option to pay for certain religious denominations, and that these have, by and large, for the length of history, been Christian religions. I know there's also examples of where other religions are paid for as well. For example, I know that from where I'm from originally, Ontario, that there are Islamic schools that are paid for, that there are Jewish schools that are paid for, etc. And I believe that's the case here in Alberta as well. And I believe that's because of the pathway that has been set by the Christian schools. And this is very interesting because it brings me back to Dutch pillarization, right. The ways in which different pillars, right? And the ways in which different groups, their whole premise, and they say they don't do it anymore, but I have different opinions on that, living apart together. And so it's interesting because while we have a public system, we still support, we are not, we're more like the States in the fact that Canadians tend to identify with a particular religion, likely not as much as the US does. All presidents in the US past have been, maybe I can't speak back, for longer than I've been alive, but at least for the last, couple of decades for sure, they've been outwardly Christian. Now here in Alberta, it's very different. I'm from Southwestern Ontario. I would say there's a much greater ethnic and cultural and religious identity there. There's much more diversity, I would say, in the small space that I was from. And I, used to work in Toronto, live in the surrounding area. So I can definitely say that there's more homogenous group here. I'm sure a lot of people would tell me that there's lots of diversity within it, and I agree with that. I do. However, I would say that by and large, what I tend to experience, there's it's a whiter population here, and it's also a more Christian population. So you can see that, for example, driving in the city of Edmonton and billboards that have excerpts from the Bible, or driving around. We used to call it, you would have to get really far out of the city in order to see anything like people would be posting signs on their space, typically farm rural areas,
Yeah.
that would have, Bible phrases, etc. You see it in the hard downtown, which I almost had to pull over my car the first time I saw it. I was so surprised.
Oh.
You would of course see things. For example, I lived in London, Ontario for a while, and there is a large Muslim population there. And so on the site of the mosque or on the site of the Islamic school, you would have maybe a board there wishing everyone a happy Eid or things like this, but not the same way. So
Right.
I thought it was very, very interesting in that regard. I think what the individuals within my interviews were speaking about was that people would almost walk around and assume certain things, like they wouldn't be open on Sundays, or they wouldn't be,
That was
because it was a day that people would observe their religious obligations, that there was a certain type of, what do I want to say? I know we've talked about this, a Calvinist or Protestant kind of work ethic was perceived to be, it was moralistic in a way that there was a certain set of morals or values that were ascribed to the right kind of citizen here in
right.
Alberta.
Right.
So in those ways, I think, and this is what others have told me, is that Alberta has, and if we look at our contemporary government, which I won't go into depth here, but they ascribe to a Christianity. Anyway, this is just shutting me down, so I won't talk about the government,
Yeah.
but I won't talk about them.
Just like in the meetup, you get into politics and I get antsy and start shutting you down.
You got it. So we'll just say then that I think a moralized version of what a good person would be, that I think aligned with certain ideas about what a Christian identity would be, has held sway for a lot longer with more people living here in Alberta than potentially where I have lived in the past. I wouldn't even say other provinces. I've never lived in Saskatchewan or Manitoba. I've never lived in any of the territories. So that's my understanding.
Yeah, I've lived in Ontario, Alberta, and BC mainly, in Canada anyway, and I would agree. And it gets stronger the further south you go.
South.
Yeah, in Alberta.
So even Calgary.
Yeah. Yeah. A Calgarian would say it's been changing since so many people from Ontario moved here.
Ha ha ha.
But so yeah, that was the concept that we wanted to talk some more about, and you've nailed it pretty well. The part of it that intrigues me, and again, in terms of some of the reading that I am listening that I've been doing, is how how there are practices that people follow. Like in North America, everyone knows that a cross represents death, which would be a symbol that comes out of Christianity, although you could argue it comes out of the Roman Empire, but it comes out of Christianity, and everybody knows that it represents death, whether they are Christian or not, right? And the Sunday closing laws are a remnant of that. It gets really interesting if you start talking about a certain work ethic, yes, because that's one of the questions that's coming up for me out of listening to the Cast book, is where is there room for disliking behavior and not wanting to be around certain people because of their behavior, regardless of their cultural background. So it's just one of the questions that's floating there. So, but what I find now, and I hadn't mentioned this before, but most of my work, I work in churches, and I moved from church to church a lot in that work because I'm a temporary pastor, and each church has its own culture and understanding of Christianity, and so that has just become interesting to me, but also interesting and annoying, because they then think that their definition of how a Christian should be, their cultural definition of how a Christian should be, is the definition. And I think I told you this story in one of our other conversations, but when I lived in Michigan, I had become acquainted with a black man married to a white woman on our street. We lived in a black neighborhood. And they had once told me that they were looking for a church that they could both feel comfortable in. And they had difficulty doing that. And so and then one Sunday he came across the street to talk to me after we came back from church, and he said, I think we found the place that's going to work. And so we've been there a couple times. We both really enjoy it, so we think we're going to commit there. And then a couple Sundays later, I saw him get out of his car totally dejected. We tended to arrive home at around the same time. And so I went over and I said, what's wrong? He said, after church today, some women from the church came over to my wife and said, if you're going to attend here regularly, you should not wear your earrings. Right? That's cultural Christianity, very narrowly defined, right? And it's also then another thing that I would call that is cultural captivity, where actually any group can become hostage to those kinds of definitions and not, they wonder why people don't join, but they have these spoken and unspoken boundaries that if you violate them, then somehow it's communicated to you that you don't belong. Sometimes very directly, like with this lady. So those are two concepts that I have a lot of interest in, and my frustration in my role as a transitional pastor often is that there is nothing deeper behind the culture nothing deeper than the cultural Christianity.
Mm.
And that's partly why I've also even named the meetup group Meaning Quest, and people get very annoyed with me when I come in and there's a ritual being practiced and nobody knows the meaning of it. Right? And then I think it's my obligation, but it may be just my provocateur to say, well, then you shouldn't be doing it unless it has meaning. And so I'll tell that story quickly. I don't think I've told you this one before about the cloth. Maybe I have. Okay, then you say kumquat, and then we move on. So that's the.
But nobody else has heard it, so we should say it.
Okay, for the sake of those who might actually watch this, and this is an amalgamation story, so it's not a specific place, but it's an example of what I'm talking about. The churches that I serve in tend to have communion once a month, and so when I was new to a particular church, then the first time that happened, it was a very interesting event to me, because when I come into a congregation, I'm always watching to read the system, I call it, to read the culture. And so that particular Sunday, the elders of that church, first of all, were dressed up way more than usual, and they sat in the front row of the church. And then the communion table, I mean, every church has some form of it. They use different words, the altar, whatever, had this big white cloth over it, one of those really pure linen, bright things. And I almost wanted to see a tag for a particular detergent on the corner of it, like this. So, and we came to the point where we were about to do the communion, and we sang a last song, and then this holy hush fell over the whole place. Like, the anticipation was really cool from my perspective. It was like, wow, this is obviously really meaningful to them. And then two of the elders went up and did, if you've ever seen a flag folding ceremony, they did that, and the whole place is quiet. And they folded the cloth up and set it aside. And then we just did communion. So, in other words, the actual event had less to it than the anticipation of the moment of I call the story the big reveal, right? And so the first meeting I had with the elders, I was really curious, this seemed to have great meaning for people, this anticipation. What's that all about? And the response was like, no, that's just how we've always done it. And I was so crushed, so disappointed. And so then I started asking questions. And this is a church that most of the people know their history quite well. They're fairly proud of their history. In fact, their original church building is in an open outdoor museum.
Ooh.
And I'd seen pictures. There are history books written about it, you know. And so I said, and this worship service that I participated in is in a brand new worship space that they had built, right? So I said, the original building that the church was in, was it like airtight? And they said, oh no. And then it's always fun in certain communities, they tend to be rural ones or people with rural background. You ask a question like that, you get a whole story, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm rural at heart, I don't know. So oh yeah, you know, in the winter we used to put bulletins in the cracks in the windows because it was such a cold draft and all that kind of stuff. And then I said, when the first church was built here, what was the next building over? And they first named the next farm up the road. And I said, no, on the same property, what was the next building over? I've seen pictures. Oh, you mean the horse stable? I said, yeah. What are some byproducts that come from stabling horses nearby? Eventually I got manure, flies, and smells. Okay, so we have a leaky church, drafty church. Short distance away, the horses are stabled, and we're going to have communion. And you don't want the flies to get on the bread. What are you going to do, right? And then the response was like, you mean that cloth is only on there for practical reasons? And I said, yeah. And so I said, how long has it been since you've seen a fly in church? Never, because it's like that fly would have to be really, really determined to get to that space because there's all these other exterior doors and stuff like that. So that's, to me, that's a cultural Christianity example, right? Where this cloth had, in fact, even was distracting from the real meaning of the ritual that was being practiced. And that kind of thing really annoys me. And that's why I think in terms of meaning quest, even behind rituals. Now people then start assuming that I'm totally against ritual and tradition. Mm. And it's very hard for them to understand that there has to be meaning to it. And then it's okay with me if you have meaning to it. So I think we're rife with cultural Christianity, and so much of Alberta culture would not even find it odd to see a Bible passage on a billboard, because that's just what happens here. Whether they're actually, first of all, a church attender, but secondly, an adherent to Christianity as it's often understood, and thirdly, whether they've ever dug deeper into the real meaning of Christianity. Right? It's still on all those levels, and even then newcomers to Alberta from other nations, it starts to become, maybe the first time they see it, it's interesting, but then, so now where this goes to something else is that what I find interesting is that so many of the headline things like social justice that are in the headlines now are forms of cultural Christianity to me. And what I mean by that, did that make any sense, or is that just like provocative?
I'd love you to explain it. I don't know if I see it myself.
Am I keeping you awake okay? Or do you need
are. Yeah. You are keeping me awake for sure.
Yeah. So Christianity at its core, prior to the year 311, when it became an allowable religion in the Roman Empire. So before then, it was an underground religion, and you could die for participating in it. So people took it really seriously. Okay, so in under Constantine, it became a publicly acceptable religion, and some would argue that that's when it started to decline as well, because then it becomes a culturally acceptable phenomenon. So within the core of Christianity, there are a lot of values. They are expressed in other religions as well, but like as the little that I know about Islam, it has a strong emphasis on taking care of the poor or giving alms, I think they call it. But Christianity has that, and we would argue that Islam copied that from Christianity. That
I'm sure the feeling's mutual.
Someone along the line took Judaism, Christianity, and then blended them into something new. But there are those that would argue that. So a concern for the widow, for the orphan, all those kinds of things are part of the core of what Christianity is all about. But now that we're in an environment where we live cultural Christianity, those things have grown a momentum of their own, I think, that is no longer rooted in the core of what Christianity is all about. So even then, social justice warriors today they owe something to Christianity in getting there, and there are all these beliefs within the culture that a person who's been done an injustice should be able to find justice. Absolutely, that I don't think too many people would argue against that, but it's been unmoored from its base and its core meaning, and so that too is a phenomenon that I find very intriguing and kind of scary.
Well, may I respond?
Please do.
Well, I think that how can I talk about this? So I think it's a really interesting idea. I think that if you're living in Canada, you are affected by Christianity, whether you claim to be one or not, because I think it represents the majority community. So I would agree with you to that extent, that if there's anybody that is fighting for social justice, they do so within a Christian-shaped environment. You'll notice the language I'm using.
Yeah, I see you being very careful.
That's
okay.
I only am being careful because that's as far as I think I'd like to go. Okay. When we think about the ideas, and from what little I've read of the Bible, there isn't a great focus on systemic inequalities. There's a lot of helping individuals, but maybe less so thinking about the systems that are unequal in the first part. Now I am wading into territory that is certainly very far from what I know. So feel free to help me out at any point. And what I would argue is happening right now with regard to Black Lives Matter, and again, as a white majority community member, I don't have any lived experience of racism, but as an individual who is supportive of the Black Lives Matter movement, of Indigenous lives, missing and murdered Indigenous women, and on trying to recognize the role of whiteness as something that shapes our everyday lives. And I mean anybody living within Canada, and I would argue North America. I think that this movement is more focused now on the idea of not just relationships, as in how do people interact with each other and how is that unequal, but also looking at the system that is necessarily built to advantage some over others.
Yeah.
And so I would say that while there's goodness that comes from, a Judeo-Christian Islamic perspective, wanting to help historically marginalized populations. When it's spoken of, for example, and I know there's different groups that are spoken of in the Bible, perhaps if we think about it now, women and children kind of thing is what I think how you shaped it. Not all women and children are treated equally. Yeah, not all women and children are treated equally. Like even within those vulnerable populations, there are some that not only have to deal, for example, with classism or having less or this type of thing, they also deal with racism, or they also deal with homophobia, or they also deal with transphobia, etc., ableism. So I would say it's not enough to look at it from a culturally Christian perspective. that it needs. And what I would ask is, can you then flip an intersectional perspective, which is what I'm talking about? And intersectionality comes from Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a lawyer that worked, and stop me if you've heard this one before from me.
No, no. In fact, I don't quite understand intersectionality. So go ahead.
Awesome. And I wouldn't say I'm an expert on this, but from what I've read with Kimberly Crenshaw and some others who have worked with this concept, Kimberly Crenshaw is a Black female lawyer, and she was working in the court system, and from my understanding of the background, and she was recognizing that when Black women were going through divorce court, they would not only have to deal with sexism in this process, but also deal, and maybe it wasn't just divorce court, but courts in general, they would deal with sexism and racism, and that it tended to be when people read the laws, it tended to focus on white women and trying to protect white women, or trying to focus on, I think seeing laws that were particularly punitive to Black men. But she said, her notice was, well, where's all the Black women in this who deal with both sexism and racism? So she was trying to think about an intersection in which these places would meet. Okay. And the goal is not to think about intersectionality as a personal identity, as in it's not, you can think about a multiple identity, but what her purpose for intersectionality is to think of the ways in which systems work against people and how they compound. So they build together and they work. So in any one situation, I might walk into a room, and if it's filled with all men, I might experience sexism. But as a white woman living in Canada, if I walked into that room in Canada, I would never experience racism. And in fact, I do not experience racism in this world, by and large. We can talk about that another time. But if a Black woman would enter that room, not only would she deal with the sexism, she would also deal with the racism. So this is, and if that woman was in a wheelchair, she would also deal with ableism, perhaps, if she identified as, and as we go on, it's not so much about her identity, although her identity is multifaceted, and as is mine. It's about how the systems work together to compound the exclusion.
Yeah. So
can you flip that back onto cultural Christianity?
Yeah.
Can you think about the ways in which an intersectional perspective might help tease apart more that understanding of what cultural Christianity might be?
No, I can't answer that right now. No, I'm still trying to understand intersectionality, because one of the things that happened in my head while you were talking was, okay, so what am I experiencing when I'm required to fill out a form in order to get a job, right? I have a severe allergy to forms. They create great anxiety in me. And
sorry to hear that.
So that's part of my identity in that way. And I feel victimized by a system that requires paperwork for everything, right? So that was one of the things that I was wrestling with as you were talking. So there's an intersection of some kind in that. But the key thing that you started off by, like, I hear you as affirming what I think I'm getting at, in the sense that these things are systemically built into societies, right? And so where the concern for that someone or that I have been done an injustice is rooted in, let's call it the Abrahamic religions, because that's the person they have in common.
Okay.
And or Old Testament religions. Okay, I don't know how to quite move into it, except where I run stuck is that it's the key to me, even as I'm listening to Wilkerson in the book, and I think I've said this in other situations before, is what about, one of the questions I love asking people now, is particularly if I'm mentoring a pastor or whatever, is what is your relationship to power and influence? Mm-hmm. Because we often wield that, and particularly as white people, without even thinking about it, right? And then within a church context, if you're the pastor and you're doing pretty decent, then then that actually builds, your influence builds to a point where it's actually dangerous to you. And if you're not aware of how dangerous it can become to you, well, the same thing I think applies in all kinds of areas where where everyone should be starting with the question, what is your relationship to power and influence in this victim story that you're telling? Because, and I've said this to you before, I remember how shocked you were the first time I said it out loud in a meetup, but I believe we've become the first culture in the world where declaring yourself a victim is an act of empowerment. Now, there's a legitimate piece of that, but there's also a piece where then you can claim that power. You can claim a certain amount of respect from the society because you are a victim or perceived as a victim, or that's part of your identity. And that's a piece that I struggle with. And that's where actually Jordan Peterson comes in, because Jordan Peterson goes to that individual again and again and again, right?
Yeah.
So
can I quickly respond to that?
Yeah, but I want to first say that definitely systemic injustice needs to be dealt with, but it needs to be dealt with by people that are very aware of their own relationship to power and how dangerous that is. That's what I want to see.
Yeah, and I agree with that people need to be more self-reflexive with regard to understanding how much power they hold and wield. And you're right that it's John Hartigan Jr.'s work. He's a cultural anthropologist as well, and this has also been forwarded by other individuals, for example, Leith Mullins and Faye Harrison, who are all, again, cultural anthropologists, so excuse my bent here. Obviously, I'm using those individuals. But they talk about whiteness as a normative identity. So within North America, it creates the norms. It's our background. It's something that everything else is compared to.
Yeah.
And of course, when you hold up a standard by which everybody else gets to be compared to, you're never going to measure up because you're not the thing that it's being measured against.
Right.
In any case, when we talk about this idea of, by identifying oneself as a victim, the language of which I pause at, I don't appreciate that language. And this is what I pointed out before to you, I'm sure. The idea that empowerment through the recognition of one's identity is somehow victimization, I think we could think about it as representation, as in, you need to recognize me for who I am. And if we continue to focus on the individuals, or this individual has, the one thing with regard to this idea of intersectionality is that if we focus on the multitudinous, that's not a word, anyway, the multifacetedness of people's identities, and if we start to think about, okay, it's a competition between who has less, who has been most expressly excluded from this environment.
Right.
We are wasting our time rather than looking at the system that upholds certain people over others, white individuals here in Canada, particularly. And, I would say, depending, mostly, I'm not going to say men or women. I think men and women who are white are, advantaged by this system in many ways.
Absolutely.
And if we focus on the idea, to me, recognizing how different identities are excluded is an important part of the empowerment process. And it's not only done by individuals who have to recognize their relationship to power. There also has to be changes to the system to involve individuals who have been historically marginalized, individuals whose voices are important, not just to be heard through a vehicle by, somebody who listens to them and then says, okay, I filter in my own understanding and then I'm going to put forward what you think, but space made at the table, so they say. And so I guess the reason why I don't like it encapsulated by this idea of victimhood equals power empowerment is that, again, it has that Jordan Peterson bent on it, right? And this, I would say, is the public Peterson rather than maybe, and I disagree with much of, it doesn't matter which version of it we're talking about, but the focus on this, because can perhaps both you and I do some more reflection on points when we become uncomfortable, and are we upset about ideas, and I'm using the royal we here because I don't know how upset I am when I hear individuals who have historically been marginalized say, hey, here's all the ways that I've been marginalized. Because to me, that it's not about that person or that individual. What that person is letting us know is this is how the system is broken. And if you want to include me as part of your, as part of the people that live in this land, then the system has to change in order for me to have the same fair standing or same start as others. And again, this is only looking at things from an equality perspective rather than equity perspective, which would recognize the legacy of historical marginalization. So yeah, I'll just disagree with the way that you phrase it.
Sure. The what becomes clearer to me each time I explore some of this is that, like, we all live by hierarchy. Doesn't matter what cultural background we have. And I'm hoping that Isabel Wilkerson gets to that in the cast book. So far she hasn't, but what she says makes that pretty clear. And I know that about myself. I live by hierarchy. There are situations I walk into the room and I'm trying to figure out who's in charge here, right? That's hierarchy. Like, I need to know if I'm okay to park my car where it is or something like that. Then I need to find someone who's in charge. And so that's part of what terrifies me, is that it feels like my hierarchical system is under attack while no one else is admitting that theirs exists.
Well, I would agree with you that I think a lot of people are uncomfortable because sorry, I have another guest.
Yeah, is that the other one?
In any case,
yeah.
So I would agree with you that a lot of people are upset with the idea that their hierarchy is being questioned.
Right.
And Pete, I think that's a really self-reflexive response of you, for you as a white male living in Canada. This is what it feels like to have somebody say, did you know that you, not only is this person disadvantaged, and this goes along with the ideas of whiteness, is people are racially disadvantaged, which means white people are advantaged. And there's research to show that people are willing to accept that people are disadvantaged, but much less willing to recognize their own advantage in the system. You're an individual who's already gotten to that point, just saying, yes, I see that that my hierarchy is being questioned, that people can say, hey, as a white male, I've, maybe the kind of opportunities I've had, the decisions made about me, the way that people feel about me is not just about my hard work, is not just about what a great, fun storytelling guy I am. It's also about that I fit, the idea of what a hard worker is, that I fit the idea of majority community member, that people can look at me and say, he's probably a good guy. And that's based on these kind of background racial ideologies that are fed to us from everywhere.
Right.
So in the same way that you're advantaged is also something that we have to think about. And that discomfort that you're feeling is, I'm not going to say it's natural, I'm not going to say it's normal. It's just something that we have to think about and think through when we're working towards a more equitable society.
Right.
Because when we think about, and this is what Kendi talks about, and I would recommend him after you're done with Wilkerson, how to be an anti-racist.
Yeah.
No.
Well, after Wilkerson is White Fragility. I have that one bought.
Good. D'Angelo's book. Okay, good. And her book has, D'Angelo and her book have lots of criticisms, etc., as every author does.
Yep.
What I recently appreciated about
Kendi, I heard a lot about too.
Yeah, Ibram X. Kendi. He's written a couple of books, Stamped from the Beginning. He's written How to Be an Anti-Racist Baby, in case anyone has any children out there. For your grandchildren, all of them. But he wrote a book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and in it he talks about that not everybody is similarly advantaged from racism. Not all white people experience the same advantages from it. And what he does is he uses this intersectional approach to help us understand how, if you are a middle to upper class individual, you're going to be more advantaged than, say, if you are a lower to middle class individual or a lower class individual. And when I say lower class, I am not talking about the moral or values kind of associated with it. What I'm talking about is kind of the income bracket and your access to resources and other things like that. I find that very useful because then it helps people recognize that when, it's hard to say all white people are advantaged by racism.
Right.
Because they are, but they're not advantaged similarly. Yes. Like all people are not similarly disadvantaged by racism. Right. And that this changes based on context. We can get down to the minutia, but we can still talk about the ways in which, like,
personality. I want to bring it to the individual again.
Well, and when we look at things, the only thing I would say is that when we look at personality, sure, there's many things that, you know, make people hit, maybe like that work or for or against them. There's many, you know, if you are neuroatypical, if you are, there's many things that would affect one's social location in this world. But the idea of racialized identity goes across the world, and this comes from long-standing imperialism, colonialism processes that have been started hundreds of years back,
Yeah.
and they still affect us today. So I guess what I would say,
Yeah, and they affect us, and they're hard to uncover. So
yes,
I agree there, right? And that's why I'm working hard to try and embrace this angst that I feel, where if the hierarchy that we have been living by gets smashed, then we have chaos, right? And order and chaos are big themes in Jordan Peterson. So, but yet, when I think about this and I compare it to what I sometimes do in a church, I do exactly the same thing. I start smashing their rituals that are empty, right? And they feel the same fear then. Is like I had one lady say to me, I can't even die in my own church after something that I did, because I had made it so unsafe for her by neglecting a ritual that she found important, right? So
I want to know how you assign meaning, though.
How do I assign meaning?
Yeah, because I guess for me, as an anthropologist I teach my students, you know, every fall I teach an introduction to social and cultural anthropology, and we learn the definition of ritual.
Right.
And rituals aren't just, they often have stories associated with them that have a symbolic significance, etc. But at times rituals are also used in a way to avoid superstition, as a habit forming to create a sense of trust or community. So are rituals useful in your opinion in that way?
So I've long had trouble with the phrase "fake it till you make it." so that I have difficulty participating in a ritual that does not immediately have meaning to it. So that's partly an answer to that question. But I've never had that question put to me before, so that's something to chew on.
Well, you've got one more question here today with me as I tie this off and go back to
to the work that you're trying to.
My prep.
Yeah, your prep. Yes.
Before the next time. I'm assuming you're going to have me back.
I think we'll talk again, or I know we'll talk again, whether it's recorded.
You've already said twice that there's things that you want to return to, so.
Well, yeah, but I never, unless I write, I can't focus enough to write them down as we talk. So, but they come back.
You're recording.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, yeah, because those are interesting questions. So I'm doing my best to embrace the angst of feeling my heart, my view of the world is under attack, and to make sense of that there is a point to that happening, that there's value to it, and yet somewhat terrified about the chaos that could result from, okay, so we've smashed the white privilege hierarchy, what replaces it, right? What, especially when I'm not sure that the people doing the smashing are familiar enough with the danger of their own power.
So you brought up a couple of things that really made me go, because why is it attacking versus questioning? What's the difference between those two? Because one is certainly much more threatening, and you've used the word threatening.
Yeah.
And when we tend to think about the power that these individuals have, these individuals are working from outside the system. And I tend to associate things like a coup or a large group in heavy numbers. Now here in Edmonton, we had 15,000 people join protests over 2 days for Black Lives Matter movement. And the outcome of that has been questioned by a lot within who are running and critiquing that movement on kind of like upper levels, because real change has not been affected. You know,
Right.
The police budget was not actually cut, it just wasn't increased. There was an article in the newspaper the other day about how they had become more militaristic than less, and that the committee has no real organizing or structural power. They're not, nobody's held accountable by them, etc. And this is all in addition to learning facts such as, there's an anti-racism committee at the city of Edmonton, none of whom are paid to do their work. So how are they affecting change when really this is seen as nods to, yes, pat on the back, I'm doing a good job at the city, without affecting real change. So to me, this idea of, when we say breaking down the system,
Right.
this system, it's like the Titanic, the boat,
Oh, yeah.
right? It's moving. Like, to me, this fear that I think is whipped up by certain politicians, I'm going to say it, politics, I'll stay away from it.
Right.
But there are certain politicians that whip up this fear, and it's a motive to make people emotional which does not allow for great reflection. Like, I think you are a unique individual that is able to reflect on the reasons. Okay, so why am I feeling this way?
Right.
What, and so you're already thinking, what would this new system look like? And when you put it in that way, how can you not feel threatened? Because if we distill an entire movement, 15,000 people joined that protest. Did they join it for the same reason? Heck no. And there's many different things that people want from this movement. That's one of its unique abilities, is that there are people who want it, who support it for a variety of reasons. And to think that everybody will come together to have one solution in the end, to me, what this does is it continues to uphold our structures of democracy, if that's the way you want to go.
Right.
I think it's still a broken system because the people aren't listening. Despite us having, and I've just gone through, so I'm working with the city of Edmonton for this coming fall to work through the Edmonton the Edmonton Police Service hearings.
Okay.
I don't know, it's called EPS. I hope that's the correct acronym. But despite having days, they had 12 panels, and despite having 12 panels of people reliving their trauma, reliving, everything that's happening. And these are not just my thoughts; these are thoughts from, as I say, people that are much closer connected, who not only, think through this, but live this experience of racism in Edmonton. It's this idea that nothing is going to happen significantly. The EPS, despite having a lot of research on this idea, has not stopped carding. They know that carding leads to over-policing of Black and Brown and Indigenous bodies. And it's shown to be a poorly motivated, with poor outcomes policing tactic. Despite this, they're still following it. Okay. So when we say smashing the system, I think it's just an emotive response.
Yeah, and I'm not denying that, right? So
okay,
that's I'm describing. But
you should have cut me off earlier and told me, Jen, I agree. I would have been like, oh, okay, sorry.
Like I believe I was expressing it as I feel angst when I confront.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I do use the language of, it feels like they're trying to smash the hierarchy that has worked for whites, I guess is the way to say it. But there too, like the defunding the police is such a, it's a slogan. So, but it's such a simplistic solution to the way I think as well, where like taking every police person, especially the ones that have been on video, these incidents, and having a discussion with them about what is your relationship to power. Because you seem to act as if when you're wearing a uniform, everybody should do immediately whatever you ask them to do, right? And when they don't, you seem to get fairly upset, and you have all kinds of tools to act out that upsetness. So there too is where I see the like, we can defund the police, but unless the police are learning to examine their own relationship with power, and when they're going over a particular limit, to have systems in place to check that would for me be huge progress. So hey, like we know that we could go all day, right? And I'm so conscious of you. You did have a coffee, but I mean, you were up early, and I think this is a good place to wind up for now. Never got to resilience. That was one that was bouncing around here too, but
We'll have to talk about that the next time.
yeah. And so we'll, I hope to post this in a short while on the Meaning Quest site. I hope to have other conversations with other people related to it. It's my intent here is to kind of demonstrate, in a sense, what kind of conversations I hope to have at Meaning Quest.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very close to picking a venue and a date to have our first. I'm gonna try to have an outdoor, bring your own chair meetup,
Cool.
where we sit distanced. I can't hear anybody through masks. If there's one thing the pandemic has revealed to me, it's that I depend a lot on lip reading.
Oh.
As always, it's been a pleasure having a conversation with you, Jen. Thank you very much.
You as well, Pete.
Okay, take care.